When Friedrich Weber stepped off the transport ship at Norfolk, Virginia in August 1943, he carried with him the weight of defeat, the uncertainty of captivity, and absolutely no preparation for what would become one of the most bewildering aspects of his imprisonment in America. He was 24 years old, a former infantry corporal from a small farming village outside Heidelberg, and like the thousands of other German prisoners streaming into American ports that summer, he expected harshness, deprivation, and the grinding humiliation that came with being a defeated enemy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What he did not expect, what none of them expected, was to witness Americans eating their food like animals at a trough, gnawing on strange golden cylinders with an enthusiasm that seemed to border on madness. This peculiar American custom would challenge everything Friedrich thought he understood about civilization, culture, and the invisible lines that separated the refined from the barbaric. The capture had come in the blazing heat of Tunisia, where the Afrika Korps had finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority in men, machines, and supplies. Friedrich had been part of the 334th Infantry Division, a unit that had arrived in North Africa too late and too poorly equipped to make any difference in the campaign's outcome. The surrender, when it came, felt almost like relief after months of retreating across impossible terrain with dwindling ammunition and even scarcer food. He remembered the British soldiers who first took him prisoner treating the whole affair with a kind of bureaucratic efficiency, processing hundreds of German soldiers like paperwork rather than enemies. Then came the transfer to American custody, the long wait in temporary holding facilities, and finally the voyage across the Atlantic in the hold of a Liberty ship that had been hastily converted to transport prisoners rather than cargo. The journey itself had been Friedrich's first real encounter with American abundance. The meals served during the crossing were substantial in a way that German military rations had not been for over a year. White bread appeared at every meal, soft and fresh rather than the hard black bread that had been standard in the Wehrmacht. There was meat, not just the occasional scrap, but actual portions of beef and pork. The American guards ate the same food, which struck Friedrich as oddly democratic. In the German military, the quality of food had always reflected rank and status. Here, it seemed, everyone ate the same meals, from the lowest private to the officers who supervised the prisoner transport. Friedrich shared the cramped quarters below deck with hundreds of other German prisoners, men from a dozen different units thrown together by the chaos of capture. Among them was Klaus Hoffmann, a tank driver from Munich who had lost his entire crew when their Panzer took a direct hit from a British anti-tank gun. Klaus was older, nearly 30, and possessed a sardonic humor that made the monotony of the voyage more bearable. There was also Werner Schultz, a quiet farm boy from East Prussia who spoke in a thick dialect that even other Germans sometimes struggled to understand. These three men, bound together by circumstance and proximity, would remain together through the processing at Norfolk and the train journey that followed. The train that carried them westward was unlike anything Friedrich had experienced in his limited travels. In Germany, prisoners were transported in freight cars, packed standing room only with minimal ventilation and no facilities. This American train had actual seats, windows that opened for fresh air, and regular stops where guards distributed sandwiches and water. Friedrich pressed his face to the window and watched America roll past, vast and seemingly endless. The countryside looked prosperous in ways that rural Germany had not been even before the war. Farmhouses were large and well-maintained, painted white with red barns that looked like they belonged in children's storybooks. Fields stretched to the horizon, planted with crops Friedrich recognized and others he did not. They traveled for 3 days, moving through Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas before finally arriving in Oklahoma. The camp that would be Friedrich's home for the next 2 years was located outside the small town of Alva, in the northwestern part of the state. Camp Alva occupied several hundred acres of flat prairie land, surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers that seemed almost apologetic in their construction, as if the Americans were embarrassed by the necessity of them. The camp itself consisted of long wooden barracks arranged in neat rows, a mess hall large enough to feed thousands, administrative buildings, a recreation area, and various support facilities. The processing at Camp Alva took most of a day. Friedrich and his fellow prisoners were photographed, fingerprinted, issued prisoner uniforms, and assigned to barracks. The uniforms were American Army surplus, dyed to remove the original khaki color and marked with large PW stencils on the back. They were given blankets, toiletries, and a booklet printed in German explaining the camp rules and the provisions of the Geneva Convention that govern their treatment. Friedrich read the booklet that first night, lying on his bunk in the barracks, and found it almost impossible to believe. Prisoners could not be forced to work except for camp maintenance. Officers could not be compelled to work at all. They would be paid in scrip for any labor they performed. They had the right to send and receive letters, subject to censorship. They could file complaints through the camp's grievance process. The first meal in the camp mess hall came the following morning, and it was there that Friedrich witnessed the phenomenon that would occupy his thoughts and conversations for weeks to come. Breakfast consisted of scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, coffee, and fruit. The portions were generous, the food hot and fresh. But it was at lunch that the real shock came. The prisoners lined up with metal trays that were loaded with fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, bread with butter, and a golden yellow vegetable that Friedrich did not immediately recognize. It was corn, he realized after a moment, but not corn as he had ever seen it prepared. In Germany, corn was animal fodder, fed to pigs and cattle but never to humans. During the desperate final years of the war, some people had resorted to eating it, but it was considered a mark of poverty and desperation. Yet here, in this American prison camp, corn appeared on the menu regularly, prepared in ways that seemed designed to make it palatable. Sometimes it came as kernels mixed with butter. Sometimes it appeared in bread. And sometimes, most bafflingly, it came on the cob, the entire ear served whole with butter melting over the yellow kernels. Friedrich watched in fascination as American guards in the mess hall picked up these corn cobs with their hands and ate directly from them, their teeth stripping the kernels in neat rows. They held the cobs by small handles that had been inserted into the ends, gnawing their way from one end to the other with obvious pleasure. It was one of the most barbaric things Friedrich had ever seen civilized people do. These were Americans, citizens of a nation that claimed to be the pinnacle of Western civilization, and they were eating like peasants at a medieval feast, using their hands to tear food from bones or, in this case, from corn cobs. The German prisoners stared. Some laughed nervously. Others looked disgusted. Klaus Hoffmann picked up his corn cob gingerly, examined it from all angles, and set it back down on his tray. Werner Schultz, the farm boy, recognized it immediately as animal feed and refused to touch it. Friedrich, driven by a combination of curiosity and extreme hunger that made even animal fodder seem appealing, attempted to eat his corn by carefully cutting the kernels off with his knife and fork. This process was tedious and inefficient, and he watched as the American guards consumed their corn in a fraction of the time it took him to extract a few kernels. That evening, back in the barracks, the corn question dominated conversation. The prisoners debated whether Americans truly considered this food fit for human consumption or whether serving it to prisoners was some form of subtle humiliation. Some suggested it was a test of their adaptability. Others insisted it was proof of American cultural inferiority. Friedrich listened to these arguments with a growing sense that they were all missing something important, but he could not quite articulate what. The camp routine established itself quickly. Prisoners who volunteered for work details were assigned to various tasks, both within the camp and in the surrounding community. The labor shortage caused by millions of American men serving overseas meant that even enemy prisoners were needed to maintain agricultural production and basic services. Friedrich volunteered for farm work, partly because his pre-war experience made him suited for it and partly because anything was better than sitting idle in the barracks. He was assigned to a work detail that went out daily to a large farm owned by a family named Patterson, about 10 miles from the camp. James Patterson was a weathered man in his 50s who ran a substantial operation growing wheat, alfalfa, and various other crops. His sons were overseas, one in the Pacific and one in Europe, and he needed help to bring in the harvest. He regarded his German workers with a mixture of wariness and pragmatic acceptance. They were the labor he had available, and the work needed doing. The guards who accompanied the prisoners to the farm spent most of their time in the shade, reading magazines, and smoking cigarettes. The work itself was hard but familiar to Friedrich, and he found comfort in the rhythm of physical labor after months of enforced idleness during his capture and transport. It was on the Patterson farm that Friedrich encountered corn on the cob for the second time, and in a context that forced him to reconsider his initial assessment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The harvest season was in full swing, and Mrs. Patterson, James's wife, had taken to preparing lunch for the workers rather than having them return to camp. She was a practical woman who saw no point in wasting time on unnecessary travel when there was work to be done. She set up tables in the shade of a large oak tree near the farmhouse and served meals that would have been considered feasts in wartime Germany. One particularly hot afternoon in late August, Mrs. Patterson brought out platters of fried chicken, bowls of potato salad, sliced tomatoes still warm from the garden, fresh bread, pitchers of cold tea, and dozens of corn cobs, boiled and dripping with butter. The American Guards dove in enthusiastically, grabbing corn cobs and eating them with the same abandon Friedrich had observed in the camp mess hall. But then something unexpected happened. The Pattersons' youngest daughter, a girl of perhaps 8 or 9, came out to help serve the meal. She was dressed in a clean cotton dress, her hair tied back with a ribbon, and she moved among the workers with the unself-conscious confidence of a child raised to be helpful. When she sat down to eat her own lunch, she picked up a corn cob and ate it exactly as the guards did, carefully and neatly, but unmistakably using her hands and teeth. Friedrich found himself profoundly confused. This child, clearly from a respectable family, raised with manners and proper behavior, was eating corn on the cob as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her parents watched her with affectionate smiles, not a trace of concern that she was exhibiting behavior that would have mortified any German parent. Mrs. Patterson herself ate a corn cob, delicately but decisively, and then offered the platter to the German prisoners with a gesture that made it clear she expected them to try it. Klaus Hoffmann declined with a polite shake of his head. Werner Schultz looked away, unwilling even to acknowledge the offer. But Friedrich, perhaps because he was younger and more adaptable, or perhaps because something in Mrs. Patterson's expectant expression made refusal seem ungracious, accepted a corn cob. He held it awkwardly, unsure of the proper technique. One of the guards, noticing his uncertainty, demonstrated by picking up his own cob and showing how to hold it by the ends and rotate it while eating. Friedrich followed his example, feeling absurdly self-conscious, and took his first bite. The taste was a revelation. The corn was sweet, not starchy and bland as he had expected, but genuinely sweet with a fresh, almost grassy flavor that was entirely pleasant. The butter and salt enhanced rather than masked the natural taste. The texture was tender but with enough resistance to be satisfying. It was, Friedrich had to admit, delicious. More than that, there was something fundamentally satisfying about the eating method itself. The directness of it, the way the hot corn and melted butter coated your fingers, the slightly messy but deeply sensual experience of it, had an appeal that transcended the mere consumption of calories. He finished the first cob and, after a moment's hesitation, took a second. Klaus watched him with an expression of bemused betrayal. Werner refused to look in his direction. The American guards grinned, pleased to see a German prisoner embracing American food culture. Mrs. Patterson simply nodded with satisfaction and went back to work, having achieved whatever small victories she had been seeking. That evening, back in the barracks, Friedrich tried to explain his experience to his fellow prisoners. It was not just about the food, he insisted. It was about what the food represented. The Americans ate corn on the cob not because they were uncivilized barbarians but because they saw no contradiction between refinement and directness. They had developed a food culture that valued pleasure and practicality in equal measure. The corn on the cob, served with little holders and plenty of napkins, acknowledged that eating could be both a civilized social activity and a messy, physical pleasure. His explanations fell mostly on deaf ears. Most of the German prisoners clung to their initial interpretation that corn consumption was a sign of American cultural inferiority. But a few, like Friedrich, had begun to wonder whether their assumptions about American culture might need revision. If Americans could be both sophisticated and practical, refined and direct, what other assumptions about them might be wrong? The weeks passed, and the rhythm of camp life continued. Friedrich worked 6 days a week on the Patterson farm, learning more about American agricultural methods and, gradually, more about the Patterson family themselves. James Patterson had fought in the First World War, had been to France, and had seen German soldiers there. He never mentioned this directly to Friedrich, but Friedrich overheard him talking to one of the guards about it. There was no hatred in Patterson's voice when he spoke of Germans, only a kind of weary resignation about the cyclical nature of warfare and the waste it represented. Mrs. Patterson, whose first name Friedrich eventually learned was Margaret, treated the German prisoners with firm kindness. She expected hard work and respectful behavior, but she also ensured they were well fed and had access to water and shade during breaks. She never discussed the war or politics, focusing instead on the immediate practical matters of running a farm during difficult times. Her daughter, whose name was Sarah, gradually lost her initial shyness around the prisoners and sometimes practiced her elementary school German on them, much to her parents' amusement and the prisoners' delight. The corn harvest came in September, and it was then that Friedrich fully understood the place corn held in American agriculture and culture. The Patterson farm grew several varieties, each suited to different purposes. There was field corn, hard and starchy, which would be dried and used for animal feed or processed into cornmeal. There was sweet corn, the type served on the cob, which had to be picked at exactly the right moment when the sugars were at their peak. Mrs. Patterson explained all this to Friedrich one afternoon when he expressed curiosity about the different varieties. In Germany, she said, they probably only grew field corn, which explained why Germans thought all corn was fit only for animals. Friedrich found this explanation almost embarrassingly simple. The German prejudice against corn was based on incomplete information, not cultural superiority. Americans had developed corn varieties specifically for human consumption and cooking methods designed to make those varieties delicious. Germans, lacking access to these varieties and methods, had dismissed all corn as inedible. It was a perfect metaphor for the broader misunderstandings that Friedrich was beginning to recognize in his own thinking about America and Americans. The autumn brought cooler weather and different work on the farm. Friedrich learned to operate American tractors, which were more advanced and powerful than their German equivalents. He helped repair fences, maintain equipment, and prepare fields for winter wheat planting. The work was satisfying in ways that military service had never been. There was a tangible result to each day's labor, a visible improvement or completion that made the effort feel meaningful. In October, the Patterson family held what they called a Harvest Festival, a tradition Friedrich learned was common throughout rural America. The festival was held on a Sunday afternoon, and while the German prisoners were not formally invited, Mrs. Patterson made it clear that any who wanted to attend would be welcome. About a dozen prisoners, including Friedrich and Klaus, accepted the invitation. Werner Schultz, still clinging to his dignity and his prejudices, refused. The festival was unlike anything Friedrich had experienced. Dozens of neighboring farm families attended, bringing food and musical instruments. There was no formal program, just an afternoon of eating, talking, and celebrating the successful harvest. Tables groaned under the weight of food, pies and cakes and casseroles and roasted meats and, inevitably, corn prepared in half a dozen different ways. There was corn on the cob, naturally, but also cornbread, corn pudding, succotash, and even a sweet corn ice cream that seemed almost miraculous. Friedrich stood somewhat awkwardly at the edge of the gathering, unsure of his place. He was, after all, an enemy prisoner, a German soldier who had fought against American and British forces. Yet the farm families treated him and his fellow prisoners with a casual friendliness that suggested they saw him primarily as a farm worker who happened to be German rather than as a defeated enemy. Children ran around playing games, ignoring the distinction between prisoners and free citizens. Women chatted while serving food, occasionally including the German prisoners in their conversations despite the language barriers. An elderly man named Harold Thompson, who farmed the property adjacent to the Pattersons, approached Friedrich and began talking to him in heavily accented but comprehensible German. Thompson had been born in Germany, he explained, and had immigrated to America as a young man in the 1890s. He asked Friedrich where he was from, about his family, about life in Germany before the war. The conversation was surprisingly personal and deeply comforting. It reminded Friedrich that before he was a soldier and a prisoner, he was a human being with a history and an identity that transcended his current circumstances. As evening approached and the festival began to wind down, James Patterson gathered everyone together for what he called a few words of thanks. He spoke about the successful harvest, the blessings of adequate rain and good weather, the hope that the war would end soon and his sons would return safely. Then, to Friedrich's surprise, he specifically thanked the German prisoners who had worked on his farm, acknowledging that without their help the harvest would not have been possible. There was a moment of awkward silence, and then several people began to clap. The applause spread until most of the gathering was applauding, not enthusiastically perhaps, but sincerely. Friedrich felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. On the truck ride back to camp that evening, Klaus was uncharacteristically quiet. Finally, he spoke. "Did you notice," he said, "that they served corn on the cob to everyone? To their most important guests, to their children, to their elderly parents? It is not food for prisoners or for poor people. It is just food. They simply like it." Friedrich nodded. He had noticed. He had also noticed that several of the most refined-looking women at the festival, women wearing their Sunday best dresses and carefully styled hair, had eaten corn on the cob with obvious pleasure and no apparent concern for their dignity. The corn on the cob was not a marker of class or culture. It was simply a seasonal treat that Americans of all backgrounds enjoyed. The revelation continued to occupy Friedrich's thoughts over the following weeks. He began to recognize that his initial horror at seeing Americans eat corn on the cob was rooted in his own rigid assumptions about how civilized people should behave. Germans had strict rules about table manners, about what foods were appropriate and how they should be consumed. These rules were markers of social class and cultural refinement. Americans, or at least the Americans Friedrich had encountered in Oklahoma, seemed to have different rules, or perhaps fewer rules. They valued practicality and pleasure alongside propriety. They had found ways to maintain social bonds and cultural traditions that were less formal but no less meaningful than German equivalents. This realization extended beyond food. Friedrich began to notice other aspects of American culture that challenged his preconceptions. The informality between ranks, the easy way officers and enlisted men spoke to each other, had initially struck him as evidence of poor discipline. Now he recognized it as a different leadership style, one based on respect and competence rather than rigid hierarchy. The American emphasis on equality, which he had dismissed as naive idealism, now seemed more like a foundational principle that influenced everything from military organization to food culture. Winter came to Oklahoma with surprising severity. The camp barracks were heated, but inadequately, and the prisoners spent evenings huddled near stoves, writing letters home or reading books from the camp library. Friedrich received his first letter from his family in November, months after his capture. His mother wrote that they were well, that the farm was still operating despite the difficulties, that his younger brother had been conscripted into the Volkssturm Home Guard. She asked no questions about his treatment or conditions, perhaps knowing the letter would be censored, but the simple fact of contact was enormously comforting. Friedrich wrote back, carefully avoiding any complaints or criticisms that might be censored, describing instead the landscape of Oklahoma and the work he was doing. He wanted to tell her about the corn on the cob, about the strange journey from revulsion to appreciation that this simple food had taken him on, about the larger lessons he was learning about assumptions and cultural prejudices. But he could not find words that would make sense without seeming either disloyal to Germany or condescending about America. So he wrote instead about the weather, about his health, about his hope that the war would end and he could come home. The farm work decreased during winter, but did not stop entirely. There was equipment maintenance, repairs to buildings, and preparation for spring planting. Friedrich and several other prisoners were assigned to help the Pattersons with various winter tasks. It was during these quieter months that Friedrich had longer conversations with James Patterson. The farmer was not particularly talkative, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. One afternoon in January, While repairing a fence in the bitter cold, Patterson mentioned that his son's unit had been involved in the Battle of the Bulge. The information had come in a recent letter, and Patterson was clearly worried sick despite the fact that his son had survived and been unhurt. Friedrich did not know what to say. He had fought in North Africa, not in Europe, but he was still a German soldier and the Battle of the Bulge had been a German offensive. Any words of sympathy might sound hollow or hypocritical. Patterson seemed to sense his discomfort. "Not your fault," he said simply. "You didn't start this war any more than my boy did. We're all just caught up in it." Then he went back to work on the fence, the conversation apparently concluded. But Friedrich thought about those words for days afterward. The American farmer had managed to distinguish between individual Germans and Nazi Germany in a way that Friedrich himself often struggled to do when thinking about Americans. Spring brought renewed activity on the farm and changes at the camp. New prisoners arrived, fresh from campaigns in Italy and later from the collapsing Western Front and Germany itself. These new arrivals brought disturbing news about conditions in Germany, about bombing raids and shortages and the growing desperation of the final months of the war. They also brought harder attitudes, more resistance to adapting to American captivity, more insistence on maintaining German identity and pride despite defeat. Friedrich found himself in an odd position among the prisoners. His willingness to eat corn on the cob, his acceptance of American ways, marked him as someone who had perhaps adapted too well. Some of the new arrivals accused him and others like him of betraying their German identity. These accusations stung, but Friedrich could not entirely disagree with them. He had changed during his time in America. The rigid certainties he had carried from Germany had softened and shifted. He no longer knew exactly what he believed about culture, civilization, and national identity. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, but for the prisoners at Camp Alva, little changed immediately. They remained in American custody, waiting for processing and eventual repatriation. The atomic bombs dropped on Japan in August brought the war to a complete end, but still the prisoners waited. Friedrich continued working on the Patterson farm, which now seemed less like temporary labor and more like his actual life. He knew he would eventually return to Germany, but part of him dreaded it. What would he find there? How would he fit into a defeated, occupied country after 2 years of living in relative comfort in America? The corn harvest of 1945 was particularly abundant, and Mrs. Patterson once again served corn on the cob to the workers. Friedrich ate his without hesitation or self-consciousness, the once alien food now familiar and welcome. He watched younger German prisoners, recent arrivals, regard the corn cobs with the same disgust he had felt 2 years earlier. He wanted to tell them what he had learned, about assumptions and adaptability and the complexity of culture, but he knew they would have to discover these things for themselves, if they discovered them at all. The autumn of 1945 brought unexpected news. James Patterson approached Friedrich during a work break with a proposition that seemed almost impossible. With his sons returning from the war but dealing with injuries and readjustment, Patterson needed reliable help for at least another year. He had applied for permission to sponsor Friedrich's extended stay in America as a contract laborer once he was officially released from prisoner status. The paperwork was complex, Patterson admitted, but he had connections in the state agricultural department and believed it could be arranged. Friedrich was stunned. The offer represented everything he had not dared hope for, a bridge between his captivity and an uncertain future in devastated Germany. Yet accepting felt like abandoning his family, his country, his identity. He asked for time to consider, and Patterson granted it without pressure. That evening, Friedrich lay in his bunk wrestling with the decision. Germany was his homeland, but what remained there for him? His father's farm had likely been damaged or destroyed. The economic collapse would make rebuilding almost impossible. Here in Oklahoma, he had work, respect, and the strange comfort of a place where his past did not define his future. He wrote to his mother, explaining the opportunity as carefully as censorship allowed. Her response came months later, delayed by the chaos of post-war mail systems. She urged him to stay in America. The situation in Germany was worse than he imagined, she wrote. Food shortages, displacement, occupation zones dividing families and communities. If he had a chance for stability and security, he should take it. She would manage. His brother had survived the war and would help with the farm. Her blessing, hard-won and generous, released him from the guilt that had paralyzed his decision. The transition from prisoner to contract laborer happened gradually through 1946. Friedrich moved from the barracks to a small cottage on the Patterson property, a space that had housed farm workers before the war. The physical distance from the camp felt symbolic, a shedding of his prisoner identity. He still wore some of his old prisoner clothing, practical and durable, but mixed with American work clothes that Margaret Patterson bought for him in town. He opened a bank account, received actual wages rather than prison scrip, and began the slow process of building a life rather than merely enduring captivity. The other German prisoners regarded his choice with mixed reactions. Some envied his opportunity. Others saw it as betrayal, choosing American comfort over German loyalty. Klaus Hoffmann, his old friend, admitted he did not understand the decision but respected it. Werner Schultz refused to speak to him, viewing Friedrich's choice as the final proof of his corruption by American culture. These judgments hurt, but Friedrich had learned during his captivity that rigid loyalty to abstract principles often mattered less than practical choices that allowed for survival and growth. By 1947, most of the German prisoners had been repatriated. Camp Alva closed, its barracks dismantled, its guard towers torn down. Friedrich attended the final gathering of remaining prisoners, a strange farewell to men who had been enemies, then fellow captives, then simply companions in an unexpected journey. They exchanged addresses, though most knew they would never correspond. The camp that had defined their lives for years would soon be farmland again, all traces of their presence erased. Friedrich's integration into the community deepened as the war receded into memory. He attended church services with the Pattersons, where neighbors who had initially viewed him with suspicion gradually accepted his presence. His English improved from halting phrases to genuine fluency. He learned American idioms, American humor, American ways of thinking that had once seemed incomprehensible. The transformation was not complete or without struggle, but it was real. The corn on the cob, that initial symbol of American barbarism, became something else entirely. At summer gatherings and harvest festivals, Friedrich ate it without thought, one food among many. But occasionally, when he bit into a fresh ear dripping with butter, he remembered his first horrified reaction and marveled at how completely his perspective had shifted. The corn had taught him that civilization was not a fixed set of rules but a constantly negotiated agreement about how to live together. What seemed barbaric could be refined. What seemed refined could be pretentious. The lines were blurrier than he had ever imagined. In 1949, Friedrich became an American citizen. The ceremony in Oklahoma City was simple, a handful of immigrants from various countries reciting the oath of allegiance together. He felt conflicted standing there, knowing he was forswearing loyalty to Germany. Yet Germany itself had been transformed by defeat, divided and occupied, no longer the nation he had left. His citizenship was less a rejection of his past than an acknowledgement of his present reality. James Patterson died in 1952, a heart attack in the fields he had worked his entire life. Friedrich was one of the pallbearers at his funeral, carrying the coffin of a man who had been his captor's employer, then something closer to family. Margaret Patterson continued running the farm with her sons, who had fully recovered from their war injuries, and Friedrich remained as their most experienced worker and trusted manager. Years passed. Friedrich married a local woman, the daughter of German immigrants who understood his displacement and complexity. They had children who grew up American in every way, their father's accent and occasional German phrases the only hints of his origins. Friedrich taught them to eat corn on the cob properly, with the little holders and plenty of napkins, explaining that this was the American way. He did not tell them about his initial revulsion. That story seemed to belong to a different person, someone he had been but no longer was. In the 1960s, Friedrich made his first trip back to Germany. His mother had died years earlier, but his brother still worked the family farm, rebuilt and modernized under the Marshall Plan. They sat together in the farmhouse kitchen, two men separated by decades and vastly different experiences, trying to find common ground. His brother asked about America, about his life there, and Friedrich struggled to explain. How could he convey the journey from prisoner to citizen, from enemy to neighbor, from rigid certainty to flexible adaptation? He returned to Oklahoma with relief, recognizing it as home in ways Germany no longer was. The prairie landscape, once so alien, had become familiar and comforting. The people, once incomprehensible, had become his community. The food, once revolting, had become his preference. He had not abandoned his German identity so much as expanded it, making room for American experiences and perspectives that enriched rather than replaced what he had been. Friedrich Weber died in 1989, a few months before the Berlin Wall fell and Germany began its reunification. He was buried in the Alva Cemetery, his headstone noting his birth in Germany and his life in America. At his funeral, attended by his American family and the farming families he had worked alongside for 4 decades, someone served corn on the cob at the reception afterward. It was late summer, the corn at its peak sweetness, and people ate it unself-consciously, using their hands and teeth, butter dripping onto paper plates. No one thought it strange or barbaric. It was just good food, enjoyed by people who knew its value. The corn on the cob had been Friedrich's first lesson in the complexity of culture and the danger of rigid assumptions. But its deeper lesson emerged slowly over decades. That simple food, eaten in a way that challenged his notions of propriety, had opened the door to questioning other assumptions. About enemies and friends, about defeat and opportunity, about identity and belonging. In learning to eat corn like an American, Friedrich had learned something more profound about the possibility of transformation and the unexpected paths that lead to home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.